节目的最后一个环节啊，再为大家推销思想先驱报刚刚为会员朋友开放的一期节目。在这一期节目中啊，我们为大家介绍了人民大学研究国际关系的达威教授在美国进行3个月的访问学者之后，对于中国时政以及对于中美关系的观察。为什么他感叹有的时候啊，大家看到美国如此之乱，但是美国的真实实力不容小觑。有的时候，当我们看到中美之间竞争激烈的时候，仍然不能忘记以我为主，要做好自己的事情。习近平以及中国的领导层应该需要紧张感，但是之外更需要多一点松弛感。这呢，就是思想先驱报我们为大家带来的主要内容。感谢给我们打赏的观众朋友们，感谢云水，感谢艺人，感谢甜点，感谢麦团，感谢如是我闻，感谢杨天，谢谢这些观众朋友们对于我们的支持。稍后华尔街联报继续为您带来过去24小时的最新消息以及其他相关内容。
First question I'd like to ask you is about your career trajectory. We met when you were in Beijing. Then, as now, you had a focus on Chinese politics, political economy. How did you get into this? How did you get interested in China's political system?
Right. So I think my career in China study, I guess, is pretty stereotypical. So I was born Chinese, grew up in China, educated in China until I graduated from college. And then I went to the US, first studied communications and then studied finance. So I think there were a couple of pivotal moments in my life. When I was growing up in China, of course, I took the Chinese system for granted and thought that's just how every country, every economy was run. And then I went to the United States and had a bit of shocker, cultural shock, economic and political shock, and saw an entirely different way of running the society, running the politics, and also manage the economy. And I took it also for granted that this was how things were supposed to be run, right? So my education in finance was very much steeped in classic neoliberal economics, about efficiency, about laissez-faire, about how market is the best at allocating resources. And then after working in the US, actually as a reporter in Congress, I went back to Beijing as a researcher, first as international relations analyst, and then joined Galvacal Dragonomics as a political economy analyst. And then I got another whole new education and started to kind of look at a lot of the neoliberal economic doctrines with new lenses, actually with the help or edification of a lot of my colleagues. We all know them well, Arthur Kroger, Andrew Batson. On the way, my career is kind of stereotypical, a Chinese person studied China. On the other side, have had the fortunate experiences of shuttling between systems and looking at different political economic systems with different lenses.
Can you describe for those who don't have GAVCO subscriptions or clients, and just a note to listeners, please contact GAVCO to become a loyal paying customer. Their notes are just absolutely fantastic. They have a lot of great analysts. But Yemi, can you describe what does a day look like for you? How do you select topics? What does work look like for you? You're not in China anymore. What does research look like?
I'm not in China anymore, so I'm now looking more through the lens of China's relationship with the rest of the world. And my role is quite different from most of my colleagues. A lot of my colleagues are very, as you said, very smart, very capable analysts. They're more quantitative analysts on, say, the Chinese economy or US economy, European economy, their financial systems, or their monetary policies. I am more a qualitative person. I like to say I'm an analyst of things that cannot be measured by numbers. So now I have the title of geopolitics. I look at things, geopolitical events that can have economic or market implications. And how do I select topics? I think it's through a Venn diagram of my own interest and what clients are interested. Right? So I kind of through broad-based reading as well as talking with smart colleagues like you, kind of get ideas of what are the geopolitical events, what are pressing ones on people's mind. And clients also send us emails or give us calls or ask us questions during meetings about the geopolitical questions on top of their mind. With a combination of those, that's how we select our research areas.
The reason we're talking today is a few pieces that you've written recently, one in the FT and then two are recent-ish. notes, client notes that you wrote, but all have the common theme of overcapacity, Chinese overcapacity. Specifically, you're looking at the electronic vehicle sector and the surge of exports of companies like BYD. That's sort of the tip of the iceberg of what's visible, but underneath it is a really fascinating political economy story about how China's institutional setup, political system, and its very interesting market creates these surges in capacity across sectors. And this has just happened wave after wave, sector after sector. When I was living in Beijing at the conference board around 2015, 2016, we were doing a lot of work on steel and cement overcapacity. And this is obviously a big story right now in Europe as China tries to, in part, export its way out of its economic slowdown. Let's start, though, with overcapacity in a more generic sense. It's not something I think a lot of citizens of market economies deal with or see a lot or even really understand. So can you just define at an abstract level, what is overcapacity in the Chinese context?
I think just fundamentally, overcapacity means there's a lot of supply and not enough demand. That happens because I think the Chinese policy always focus on stimulating supply, and that is still the case today. And also because the Chinese system, throughout every ministries in the central government, every local governments, all the corporations, state-owned or private, they have been conditioned to be very responsive to policy incentives. And so when there is supply stimulus, every agency, every local government, and every entity in the Chinese economy are mobilized to produce. And in the meantime, the demand, I think, are not as because these are individuals and they're not necessarily as responsive to the policy stimulus. So that can create this lopsided, big supply and not sufficient demand. You're right, as you said, a lot of the excessive capacity has been absorbed through exports. But I think you notice that this is a big topic right now, catching a lot of attention globally, because the Chinese export of excessive capacity is a bigger problem now than before. One, because, as you mentioned, it's one thing to accept importing a lot of Chinese steel and cement, relatively simple technologically and relatively low value added, versus accepting deindustrialization by Chinese overcapacity in sectors like automobile, much more high-tech, higher value added, and also much more complicated systems and arguably just more central to any industrialized country's industrial health. Hence, we're seeing a lot more attention and a lot more pushback on the Chinese overcapacity.
I just want to linger on the policy angle of this first. You have a recent FT op-ed that's from February 4th, so just a few weeks ago. We're recording this on February 20th, and it's called "China's Call of EV Overcapacity Will Bring Little Relief to Europe." You write, overcapacity is a chronic affliction of Chinese industrial policy. Like an adaptable virus, it is difficult to eliminate and requires continuous suppression, which often takes the form of government-orchestrated industry consolidation. I wonder if we can go back again into the trenches of central, provincial, and local government decision-making here, because on the one hand, overcapacity is not always something celebrated by central policymakers in Beijing. They often find it a scourge. Things like supply-side structural reform, which came out in, 2015 or so, was designed to, one of the planks of it was to go after chronic industrial overcapacity in all of these sectors, which was holding down prices. Can you talk again about why, if it is this adaptable virus that the central government is trying to stamp out, what does it look like on the ground that creates this overcapacity? You had this really arresting statistic in your FT piece. You say in 2014 alone, more than 80,000 companies in China registered to enter the electronics vehicle sector, more than doubling the previous year's number of new registrants. What happens? What signals are being sent? What policies roll out where you basically have nearly 100,000 companies rushing into this new EV sector?
The electric vehicle sector is absolutely a fascinating story. I think it's also a big educational experience to myself analyzing it. So the first time I looked at the industry in China, it was 2016. At that time, I think, again, I was still very much caught up in all those efficiency, neoliberal economic doctrines. And I looked at it and thought this absolutely could not work. Why? Because at that time, I think each passenger vehicle could receive up to about 17,000, 19,000 US dollar subsidy, right? So its central government has central subsidies and the local government can match the subsidy by up to 100%. And then in addition, on the production side, there were subsidies to companies in the terms of cheap land, cheap energy, and then production credit. It had an absolute feeding frenzy for a lot of these companies to enter the industry. And then a lot of these companies ended up being quite low tech, low value added. So there were these low speed, low range, low tech electric vehicles that were not much better than scooters. And then because of this, local government also were incentivized to install local protectionist policy to attract production into their cities, into their provinces, right? So they rolled out a slew of subsidies. And then to tie local production to the subsidy eligibility. So even in those days, even BYD had to scatter their production facilities into different provinces or cities in order to qualify for those local subsidies. And another layer of a local incentive was to buy electric vehicles into the local taxi fleet or local bus fleet. Oftentimes they were just sitting idle, not running on the road. But again, they take the number, therefore they were eligible for central government subsidies. And in those years, there was a very peculiar phenomenon. So reliably, at the end of each year, the EV sales in China would surge. And then when you look into the data in detail, it was not that this consumers suddenly found electric vehicles more appealing at the end of the year, but it was because local governments, they had annual sales target to meet. Therefore, they accelerated procurement for the taxi fleet, government vehicles, for electric buses, and just bought a bunch of them. Hence, they can say that they have, in their locality, they have met X number of electric vehicles by the end of the year, right? So when I looked at that picture, and I decided that this was just another massive waste of industrial policy. There was no way that from this wasteful spending, from local protectionism and fragmented industry, there could emerge global leaders in electric vehicles. And I was massively wrong. So I think actually from this overcapacity that created a fiercely competitive industry, because Chinese companies themselves had to fight rounds and rounds of price wars. And two, because the Chinese government has been also very skillful at dealing with overcapacity throughout decades and through many sectors they have put their industrial policy focus on. So there have been several rounds of culling of overcapacity by one, raising the license standards for company entry, for production licenses. And then two, they gradually withdraw subsidies. And they start with the low range, low speed end, right? So they call those low value added, low tech companies first. And then the industry leaders then started to emerge from this quite brutal competition. That's why now we have the BYDs of China.
So can I ask you if this pattern describes the sort of overcapacity story in EVs, but also in other sectors? Chinese central government identifies something as being important. So in this case with EVs, in 2009, China says, okay, this is a strategic emerging industry. I feel like Beijing knows what's going to happen next, which is they put out their own policy inducements. They know the political economies, and they know local governments are going to do the same. They know they're going to have this wave of new entrants. They put up the barriers so that there's no foreign competition when the industry is in its infancy. They allow this very cutthroat competition to occur. And then they know at some point they'll now start tapping on the brakes and let the fittest, in a Darwinian sense, they'll let the fittest sort of survive. And now they will have scaled up in a protected domestic market. Definitely there's waste and inefficiency, but if you want to make an omelet, you've got to break some eggs. And so then once they have this strong domestic champions, then they unleash them on the world. And then maybe they start allowing some foreign competition domestically in China because they know at this point they've created some pretty sizable behemoths. Is that story resonate with you at a structural level in terms of what we're seeing here?
Absolutely. So I think you just narrated the ingredient for the omelet that I forgot to mention, which is the protectionism and also the strategical withdrawal of protection. Right? So when the industry was at the infant stage, the protectionist wall was very high. So China designed the subsidy eligibility requirements to exclude both foreign battery makers as well as foreign car makers. And then to allow these Chinese infant producers to grow up in a relatively safe environment. And then when the government felt perhaps these companies were teenagers, not infant anymore, they kind of lowered the wall a little bit, right? So it's 2019, China allowed Tesla to come and establish a mega factory in Shanghai. And Tesla was able to, one, establish the factory without the usual joint venture or requirement. And two, Tesla was eligible for the full suite of support. And in those couple of years, even the BYD was knocked back. I think BYD founder was saying their only goal was survival. They lost market shares and the sales were struggling. But also, again, they proved that they were able to adapt to fierce competition. So BYD came up with a new battery called the Blade, which can charge faster, power a car on a longer range, and it's also more compact. And then just in a couple of years, BYD not only recovered its domestic market share, now I think it's going to knock Tesla off the perch as the number one seller of EV in the world. The Chinese have a phrase called introducing the catfish into the sardine tank. Right? So they kind of introduce the fierce catfish into the tank to cull the weak and make the strong ones run faster.
Now that we have some of these running faster, and again, BYD is a really good example of this, let me pivot now to talk about what it looks like when this industrial machine then starts exporting its products. As you say, it's one thing when you're having relatively low technology outputs like steel, which going onto the global market, and while you do have some pockets of frustration arising, it's not like the United States, for example, has the most robust global steel sector. The story is different when you're talking about Europe and automobiles. There's now just an acute sense of, as you said before, deindustrialization, as you see waves of lower priced, very good EVs now coming into the market. So what is your sense of how concerned European capitals are about this? And what is your sense on how, let's take Germany, for example, what is the playbook for Germany in how they're going to deal with this? And the complication I'd be curious for your insights on. Does the fact that German automakers continue to rely on China as a growth market, does that constrain room for German policymakers to take punitive actions to try to limit this import flux out of a concern that China will retaliate against German automakers in their market?
So let me start with the broad picture about the trade frictions that kind of Chinese overcapacity is creating, particularly in developed countries. I think several things have changed fundamentally that will influence China's trade relations with these countries for years to come. One, we're talking about the China has ascended the value chain. It's the countries like the US, like Europe, they may be willing to absorb Chinese exports in cement, steel, textile, paper. It's much harder. They're much more unwilling to absorb Chinese exports in the much more valuable and much more technologically complex exports, such as in cars, and possibly soon passenger airlines. And then two, another bargain that Western countries have had to China is breaking down, right? In the past, China was exporting a lot, but also buying a lot. Now, the Chinese demand has been softening, especially in the post-COVID recovery. But then Chinese exports has still remained very robust and may expand in the coming years as China doubled down on supply side stimulus, doubled down on industrial policy. So these countries feel they are getting worse and worse deal trading with China. And three, I think there was an implicit or explicit grand bargaining of Western countries, economic exchange with China, which I think can be summarized as political liberalization in exchange for economic development and prosperity. Or in Germany, the catchphrase used to be change through trade. And today, nobody believes in that anymore, right? So nobody, I think, in the West believes that China is on a liberalization trajectory. So then there's the political justification for trade and for powering the China's ongoing economic growth as well as technological upgrade through Western markets that has broken down. So I think that all these are contributing to what we saw first trade war between US and China, and now possibly trade war between Europe and China. And I think Europe is now coming to the picture because one, they cannot allow their auto industry to be deindustrialized. It's just too central to the European economy and to it is the European industrial backbone. And especially at a time when the European economy and European manufacturers are struggling. They're struggling with high energy price, high wage, and then so the anxiety about deindustrialization through China is very high in Europe. Also, they have the story, the cautionary tale of solar panel in their mind. So a few years ago, Europeans started anti-dumping, anti-subsidy investigation on solar panels, and China retaliated and sort of like through negotiations and forced Europe to back down, mainly by threatening German luxury cars and pressured then German Chancellor Angela Merkel to pressure on Brussels to have a negotiated settlement on solar panels with China. And now the outcome of that is very obvious. The outcome is pretty much the annihilation of the European solar panel industry. And what's left of the so-called European solar industry is the installers, utilities. And then they are now actually advocating on behalf of Chinese manufacturers because they want to be able to keep importing cheap Chinese solar panels. And then, the manufacturers have gone extinct. So Europeans have that story in their mind, and they don't want to repeat that. But exactly how this will play out on the electric vehicles. So on one hand, I think Europeans are going to play tougher because, again, they cannot bargain away the auto industry. And also because now they believe they have a stronger hand vis-a-vis China because China depends on the European market a lot more now that the US market is close to China and China needs exports to power its ongoing growth now that its property sector is shrinking. So Europe believes that they can play tough with China. On the other hand, it's also hard for me to see Europe play tough. One major reason is what you mentioned, Germany. Germany still is very dependent on China for growth, for sales and for growth and for prosperity, and especially the German auto industry. A few months ago, I visited Berlin and talked with people in the industry as well as German officials, economic trade officials. And they say Volkswagen, which competes with BYD in the same kind of mid-market segment, is very worried about losing market shares in China, losing market shares in third countries, and losing market shares in the home turf in Europe. Right? So they're prompting their officials to do something about this and to look into the Chinese subsidies. But they also are very scared of Chinese retaliation. Last time I checked, I think about 40% of Volkswagen cars are sold in China. And then there are the luxury ones, the BMW, the Mercedes. I think they are still thinking that they are still kind of way bit above the watermark, that they are in the market, in the luxury market, where BYD does not have a huge presence yet. So they might have still a few years before the Chinese competition comes. They're not willing to sacrifice this few years of growth and profit in China. So they're also advocating against any trade tension with China.
What is your sense on how Beijing processes this external frustration with the exportation of its sort of industrial overcapacity machine? Is it their view that, fine, there's going to be some whinging in some foreign capitals, but like with the solar picture, ultimately this is good for China, even if it invites some external pushback? I think, the last time I felt this amount of consternation in Europe was in 2016, after you had the Chinese takeovers of KUKA, the robotics company, and then ChemChina made a bid for a German industrial company, and that felt like a sea change in at least German views on China, and announced the early phases of a sort of a strategic rethink about the relationship. It feels like that's happening now. You had the anti-dumping investigation announced, just the number of European voices who are worried about this deindustrialization. Do you think this is going to redirect Beijing's efforts, or do you think that they are well on the path to essentially trying to rush for global EB leadership and dominance, especially in global South markets, that they don't really care if there's going to be a bit of kvetching in Brussels and Berlin?
I don't think this will prompt fundamental change of behavior or calculation in China. One, because the Chinese playbook has always worked in the Chinese mind. They achieved their objectives, right? So their industries have steadily climbed the technological and value chain. They have, steadily, reliably created global, not only domestic champions, but global leaders in the industries that they focus on. So I think there's no reason for them to doubt that this will be another success story, and then to the extent that there are trade tensions that are going to be temporary. That said, I think China is looking at Europe, is preemptively looking at a number of avenues to address the perhaps upcoming potential tariffs. It will be a combination of sticks and carrots and evasion. So the sticks will be retaliation on, similar anti-dumping, anti-subsidy tariffs on European sectors, market denial to European exports, and perhaps even, regulatory retaliation on European German car companies invested in China. And I think China now is also has a whole of government approach, directive to direct all the ministries, customs, trade, finance, diplomacy, transportation, to look at both to facilitate and streamline the exports of electric vehicles, and two, to help them invest in production facilities overseas, hence in preparation for the tariffs and to be able to get around it.
What is the next overcapacity story, do you think, in China?
The more immediate one is semiconductor chips, perhaps the legacy chips. So if you just look at how many facilities that are being built in China, as well as the rest of the world, there is just no question that massive overcapacity will come down the pike very soon. The next big one probably will be airliners. China just debuted its first homegrown airliner in Singapore, and China has been trying to grow its own airline industry for decades, and its moment may have come. And I think Airbus and Boeing will have to fight off Chinese competitors perhaps in a couple of years.
Where would those markets be, do you think? I'm imagining those are not in developed markets. Is that in the global South? You see that playing out?
Mm-hmm. The global South is the natural market, but I think that China will still focus a lot on the European market. And that has to do with because one, the developed countries just have a lot more purchasing power, right? So that's the priced market. And two, the US, I have no doubt the US will design policy and barriers to keep Chinese airplanes out. And the US can do that because the US has a system that is not shy of being political. So the US can design policy just with the explicit goal of saying, we just want to keep the Chinese exports out, right? And then three, the US has turned its back on WTO. So the US has no issue with coming up with protectionist policy that run roughshod over WTO rules. And Europe is far from there yet. Europe still is very faithfully holding on to WTO rules that makes it harder to design protectionist policy. So even if, and also, we discussed it before, Europe is not a single entity like the US is. To come up with a policy has to wrangle with all the different members that have different relationship with China and also different philosophy about trade. Some are more laissez-faire, some are more comfortable, like France, with protectionism. Europe will be probably very slow coming up with some trade defense, if at all. So I would think that, yes, the developing countries is a natural market, but I expect that Chinese airlines to penetrate the European market to a degree as well.
I'm way out of my zone of comfort here talking about Chinese commercial airliners, but I suppose I had it in my head that there would be a great deal of airliner and customer hesitation about getting on a C919 plane. Even if there were not explicit market barriers, I struggled to see major airliners picking up Chinese jets, even if they get regulatory approval. You sense that the market is more ripe than cynics like myself expect?
It is a barrier, but it's far from insurmountable. I know it's not apple to apple. I think we had this skepticism about Korean cars, for example. We also now we're skeptical about whether Western customers will embrace Chinese cars, right? Because Chinese products are always seen as low quality, shoddy, unreliable. But that's changing. Also, I think in European market, we keep talking about European, we have to, again, be reminded it's not monolithic. Countries like Spain, where I am right now, Portugal, Greece, they don't necessarily have the same view about Chinese products as like the sort of the blue chip consumers in Germany or France, and don't necessarily have that kind of a brand loyalty. And three, I think Chinese company, they're smart too. I don't exactly know what kind of sales and marketing strategy a Chinese airliner will deploy. But for example, with BYD, one strategy they've used to penetrate the European market and raise their brand awareness is to go after the rental companies first, the car rental company. Right? So rather than dealing directly with consumers. So the rental company, they're less brand loyal. They care about a good deal. Through that way, they give the drivers exposure to their cars and hence kind of lower down that resistance to their products.
And China's never one someone should underestimate. As you say, we've seen this before where there's a view that China can't innovate. And now suddenly the story we're having now is about really fantastic EVs that China is producing at a lower cost that are out in the international marketplace.
大家好，欢迎收看华尔街电视，我是小安。你准备好去异国旅行放松心情了吗？度假我们又该往哪里去呢？如何用该往哪里去呢？如何用最小的钱享受最大的旅行体验呢？这一期亚洲大眼睛就与您分享来沙漠中的未来城市迪拜。迪拜坐落于欧洲、亚洲和非洲的交叉口，海陆空皆可非常容易的抵达。据统计，世界1/3的人口乘坐飞机不到4小时便可抵达迪拜，另外2/3的人口乘坐飞机8小时左右即可抵达。世界各地飞往迪拜的航线超过125条，高速公路网络贯穿迪拜和周边的阿拉伯国家。或者你也可以乘坐邮轮前来，繁忙的迪拜拉希德海港每天都有多艘邮轮进出港口。乘搭迪拜地铁是轻松出行的好方式，地铁红线沿迪拜主干道 Sheikh Zayed 路延伸，向南一直通达杰贝阿里区。 购买预付的 NOL 交通卡，畅享整个公交网络的服务，包括地铁、有轨电车、巴士和出租车。阿联酋的国家政策规定，必须重视有特殊需要的旅客接待工作。迪拜有方便轮椅上下的专用出租车、公交车和地铁列车上也为身障人士预设了专门的空间。迪拜地处阿拉伯沙漠，全年气候温暖，10月份到4月份的冬季气候最为温和宜人，平均气温为20度至30度，游客可以感受微风阵阵与宜人晚阳，享受难忘的海滩休闲时光。6月至9月的夏季月份则酷热无比，平均温度在35至45度之间。此时，众多的室内景点和设施就开始热闹起来。迪拜因此也是一处世纪皆宜的目的地。迪拜是一座包容性极强的多元文化都市，来自全球200多个国家和地区的人们以此为家。这座绚烂多样的城市荟萃了可口的各国美食、多变的时尚风采和赏心悦目的娱乐活动，好奇心满满的游客定会乐在其中。和到访其他海外地区一样，来到迪拜也需要尊重当地的习俗与文化，建议穿着得体。这点在光临购物中心和餐厅等公共场所，还有参观历史和宗教地区时要尤为注意。迪拜也是中东地区最大的商务枢纽，正处全球中心的地理位置，这一地利让它在国际贸易中发挥着重要作用。商务旅行人士在异性职业人士接触时，若对方不与你握手，请不要介怀。为避免尴尬，最好等对方主动与你握手。每周周日至周四为工作日，则为周末。迪拜云集世界最大型的品牌店、精品店及购物中心，游客从不缺购物选择。阿拉伯联合酋长国于2020开始征收5%的增值税，但游客在迪拜仍可轻松享受免税购物的福利。全程的零售商都会热情地帮助你顺利走完相关申请流程，店员会将免税标签附在销售收据的背面。游客经机场拉希德港或阿曼哈塔路上过境点离开迪拜前，需要核验相关的免税标签。游客可按个人意愿支付小费。迪拜大多数餐厅最后的账单计费已包括税费和服务费，但客人也常会支付账单的10%付15%为小费，具体取决于服务质量。请记住，一般而言，在迪拜服务人员不要求客人支付小费，但对方会感谢你的慷慨。那究竟迪拜有那些不可错过的景点呢？谢勒兰在台前谢勒兰购物中心。谢勒兰购物中心是迪拜乐园最大的大卖场，汇集了350多家店铺、75个餐饮场所和1家食品影院。这个占地120万平方英尺的购物娱乐天地，坐落在 Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed 路上，围绕一座精心设计的花园而建。露天屋顶是这个环保购物中心的亮点，展现了多样的园艺设计风格，从日式花园到迷你版的迪拜奇迹花园植物展区，种类繁多。游客可以在这里找到阴凉的座位，享受时尚咖啡馆的休闲舒适，还能体验丰富多彩的季节性娱乐活动。迪拜岛棕榈码头，迪拜最新的游艇码头迪拜岛棕榈码头将成为游艇党的新宠。这里有最先进的设施，还能直达迪拜岛新兴的海滨乐园。码头能够容纳13艘超级游艇，设有248个施泊位和40个干泊位和40个干泊位。从海滩活动、水上运动到周边酒店提供的美妙住宿、美食和娱乐，来到这里，所有人都能度过精彩纷呈的一天。GITCH 娱乐胜地 GITCH 位于古瑞购物中心，提供30多种不同的室内游戏，适合各个年龄段的人。你可以参加忍者舞狮课程，从10米高的滑梯上畅快滑下，或者在攀岩墙上挑战地心引力，这里会为每个人带来无尽的乐趣。与家人一起打一局保龄球，或者系好安全带，准备迎接 Skysurf 的挑战。这是迪拜第一个滚轴滑翔体验，能让你在场馆内漂浮起来。Cloud 22 Cloud 22位于迪拜地标皇家亚特兰蒂斯酒店内，带来前所未有的尊贵与奢华享受。屋顶泳池专供酒店住客独享，你可以与名流贵客和一线明星们一同畅游其中。来到 Cloud 22，就来悠闲地躺卧在复式小屋或90英尺无边泳池的水下日光浴床上，尽情欣赏阿拉伯湾和朱美拉棕榈岛壮丽无比的景色。最放松惬意的享受，莫过于一边沐浴阳光，一边品尝着精致的法式地中海美食。迪拜岛海滩， 迪拜岛海滩以其所处的新兴社区迪拜岛而得名，已经悄然成为家庭游客和周边酒店客人享受阳光的新去处。水上运动爱好者可以在波涛中尽情探险，而其他人则可以召集伙伴来场友好的沙滩足球或排球比赛。最让人惊喜的是，这里还是迪拜首个对狗狗全开放的海滩，宠物主人们可以带着自家毛孩子一起游泳或在海边玩耍。想来这里度假的朋友们可以乘坐水上交通抵达，如果你是开着船或游艇来的，直接停靠码头就好。这里吃喝玩乐样样齐全。接下来的几个月里，还会有更多有趣的活动和景点等着大家。霓虹星系迪拜河畔风景小镇是位于迪拜乐园及度假村的一个风景优美的户外区域，来多层室内冒险游乐场霓虹星系更为这一区域锦上添花。霓虹星系占地860平方米，专为儿童和青少年设计。游乐场内提供刺激好玩的忍者课程、划船区和海洋球项目及障碍挑战赛和以太空为主题的教育活动。此外，这里还特别设立了专门的幼儿区，给小朋友们带来无穷的欢乐。迪拜鳄鱼公园迪拜鳄鱼公园毗邻拥抱自然的梅苏纳公园，占地共2万平方米。内有250多头尼罗河鳄鱼，在这个亲子好去处，游客可以观赏这些威风凛凛的生物，看它们怡然的栖居在3座大型温控盆地内，其中有令人心绪平静的瀑布，还有蜿蜒绵亘的沙岸。游客也可以在数个喂食区和它们互动。同时，如果你想深入了解这种动物，也可以在现场的一座博物馆内深入挖掘关于鳄鱼的大量知识。迪拜购物中心唐人街迪拜购物中心本就是世界上最大的购物和娱乐目的地，如今这家商场又增设了唐人街，经营规模进一步扩大。这处新景点占据购物中心1层的大片区域，为游客带来更加丰富多彩的零售、餐饮和健康选择。走进唐人街的大厅，各种主题装饰元素随处可见，从古朴的红灯笼到霓虹灯的海洋，从大熊猫雕塑到装饰临街店面的歇山顶造型屋檐，眼前的一切会让你仿佛飞越万里来到中国。这里还有新加坡著名美食大排档 Hawker Chain 的迪拜分店。虽然唐人街尚未全面营业，但目前已有几家餐厅和店铺开业经营，未来几周还将有众多店面陆续开放。迪拜气球迪拜气球是一个双绳氦气球，游客可搭乘升上300米高空，从云端饱览迪拜海滨和璀璨天际线的无敌全景。升空过程大约10分钟。在此期间，你可以从最佳视角欣赏朱美拉棕榈岛的风光，还能尽览这一人工奇观的全貌。在晴朗的日子，你甚至还能望见哈利法塔和迪拜市中心。迪拜港迪拜码头拥有最先进的游船码头和本地区规模最大的码头，当然也有海滨区迪拜港。在这里，你可以将迪拜波光粼粼的海岸线尽收眼底。迪拜港还拥有12万平方米的邮轮设施，在910米长的码头设有2个邮轮终点站。这处世界一流的海上目的地现已对公众开放，而且周边新酒店、咖啡馆、零售店和餐厅也将陆续开张。亚洲之旅，你有哪些地方想去呢？欢迎留言告诉我们，让我们一起探索亚洲的美。大家好，我是小安，今天给大家带来了关于迪拜的旅行攻略。迪拜是一个充满魅力和多元文化的城市，拥有美丽的海滩、世界级的购物中心和令人惊叹的建筑。无论是购物狂还是探险家，迪拜都能满足你的需求。首先，迪拜的交通非常便利，无论是飞机、汽车还是邮轮，都可以轻松抵达。迪拜地铁是出行的好方式，购买预付的 NOL 交通卡可以畅享整个公交网络的服务。此外，迪拜对有特殊需要的旅客也非常友好，提供了专用的出租车和公共交通空间。迪拜的气候温暖宜人，冬季是最佳旅行季节，平均气温在20度至30度之间。夏季虽然酷热，但也有各种室内景点和设施供游客选择。另外，迪拜是一个非常包容的城市，拥有丰富的美食、时尚和娱乐活动，定会让您留下美好的回忆。在迪拜旅行时，我们也要尊重当地的文化和习俗，建议穿着得体，尤其是在购物中心、餐厅和参观历史和宗教地区时要注意。此外，商务旅行人士在与异性职业人士接触时，需要注意对方是否愿意握手。迪拜是购物的天堂，拥有世界上最大的品牌店和购物中心，游客可以轻松享受免税购物的福利。 此外，迪拜还有许多不可错过的景点，如塞勒伦购物中心、迪拜岛、棕榈码头、基业、ITC 娱乐胜地等，满足不同年龄段的需求。最后，我想问问大家，你们对迪拜有什么样的想法呢？有没有什么旅行计划或者想去的景点？欢迎在评论中与我们分享。接下来，我们将继续带给大家更多有趣的旅行资讯，敬请期待。我们下期再见。